3 days after my father's funeral, my younger brother sold his old pocket watch to a pawn shop for $200. He tossed the cash into his wallet, laughed, and said, "Dad spent his whole life collecting useless junk. At least one piece finally paid for lunch." I wanted to stop him, but the watch legally belonged to him. We had divided our father's belongings exactly as the will instructed, and Jake had chosen the old silver watch because he thought it looked antique enough to sell. I never imagined I'd see it again. Then, 72 hours later, someone knocked on my front door. Standing outside was a man wearing a dark navy suit with a leather briefcase tucked beneath his arm. He introduced himself as Dr. William Harris, curator of the New England Museum of American History. Before I could ask why he was there, he held up a photograph of my father's pocket watch and quietly asked, "Mr. Brooks, do you know where this watch is?" I nodded without thinking. His next sentence made my knees feel weak. "Our museum is prepared to pay $2 million for it." I stared at him, convinced I had misunderstood. $2 million for an old watch my brother had sold for barely enough to fill his gas tank? But the money wasn't what shocked me the most. It was what Dr. Harris said next. "The value isn't the watch itself," he whispered. "It's what's hidden inside." Before I explain how one careless decision nearly erased a piece of American history, let me tell you about the man who owned that watch, my father. My name is Ethan Brooks, and until the day my father passed away, I believed I knew almost everything about him. Robert Brooks lived a quiet life in a small suburb outside Boston. He had worked as a high school history teacher for more than 35 years before retiring, and anyone who met him would describe him as kind, patient, and incredibly humble. Our house was filled with old books, maps, faded photographs, and small antiques collected from flea markets and estate sales. While other fathers spent weekends watching football or fixing cars, Dad spent his Saturdays wandering antique shops carefully examining dusty shelves for forgotten pieces of history. He wasn't interested in buying expensive collectibles. He loved the stories behind ordinary objects. Every item on his bookshelf came with a tale about the people who once owned it, and listening to those stories became one of my favorite childhood memories. Dad's favorite possession was a worn silver pocket watch that he carried almost every day. It wasn't flashy or covered in diamonds. In fact, the outer case was scratched from decades of use, and the chain was repaired so many times that it barely matched the original metal anymore. Whenever I asked where it came from, he would simply smile and say, "Some things become valuable because of the people who carry them, not because of the price someone puts on them." As a child, I never understood what he meant. I assumed it belonged to Grandpa or perhaps some distant relative. That never offered another explanation, and eventually I stopped asking. Looking back now, I realize he wasn't avoiding the question. He was protecting an answer he wasn't yet ready to share. My younger brother Jake couldn't have been more different from me. While I became a history teacher just like our father, Jake chased quick opportunities that promised easy money. He switched jobs almost every year, invested in businesses he barely understood, and constantly searched for shortcuts instead of stability. Dad loved them as much as he loved me, but the two of them rarely agreed on anything. Jake often joked that Dad wasted his life collecting old junk instead of making real money. Dad would simply smile and reply, "One day you'll learn that not everything valuable can be measured in dollars." Jake usually laughed and changed the subject. None of us realized how important those words would become. Dad's passing came quietly after a short illness. The funeral was simple, exactly as he had requested. Friends, former students, neighbors, and colleagues filled the small church, each sharing stories about how he had changed their lives through kindness and patience rather than wealth or status. Standing beside his casket, I realized my father had left behind something far greater than money. He had left behind respect. After the service, Jake and I returned to Dad's house to begin sorting through his belongings. The lawyer explained that our father hadn't owned much of financial value. The house would be sold, the savings divided equally, and each of us could choose personal items before everything else was donated. I chose Dad's collection of history books, his handwritten journals, and the old wooden desk where he had spent decades preparing lessons for his students. Jake walked through the house with a cardboard box, tossing things inside almost at random. His old typewriter might be worth something. Maybe these binoculars too. Then he picked up the old silver pocket watch from Dad's bedroom dresser. He held it toward the window, turning it over in his hand before shrugging. This antique looks old enough to sell. I smiled sadly and said, "If you're not interested in keeping it, I'd like to have it. Dad carried that watch every day." Jake laughed. Dad also wanted me to appreciate history. We can't all be history teachers, Ethan. Before I could answer, he hung up. I remember standing in my kitchen, staring at my phone, wondering why losing that watch felt like losing my father all over again. It wasn't about the money. It felt like the last piece of him had disappeared into the hands of a stranger. 3 mornings later, while I was making coffee before work, my doorbell rang. Standing outside was the man in the navy suit carrying a leather briefcase. After introducing himself as Dr. William Harris from the New England Museum of American History, he carefully removed a photograph from his folder and placed it in my hands. It showed my father's silver pocket watch resting on a velvet display cloth. "We've been searching for this watch for nearly 18 years, he said. I looked at him in complete confusion. "I'm sorry," I replied. "My brother sold it to a pawn shop a few days ago." Dr. Harris slowly closed his eyes as though hoping I had said anything else. When he opened them again, his expression was filled with urgency. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "that watch isn't valuable because it's made of silver. Hidden inside the case is a compartment containing documents believed to have belonged to one of the most important figures in American history. If those documents are still there, your father spent decades protecting something priceless without telling anyone." My heart began racing. I stared at the photograph before looking back at Dr. Harris. There was only one question I could ask. Who did that watch really belong to? Dr. Harris looked at the photograph for a long moment before carefully placing it back inside his folder. "Officially," he said, "the watch once belonged to Captain Nathaniel Warren, a Union Army officer during the Civil War. After the war, Captain Warren became one of the men responsible for protecting a collection of handwritten military journals and government correspondence that historians believed had been destroyed in a courthouse fire more than a century ago. For decades, researchers searched for those documents without success. Then, 18 years ago, an old photograph surfaced showing Captain Warren wearing this exact pocket watch. During a restoration study, experts noticed something unusual about the watch's thickness. They became convinced it contained a hidden compartment, but the watch had already disappeared into a private family collection. We spent years following every lead, and every trail eventually went cold." He paused before looking directly into my eyes. "Until we discovered your father had been carrying it." My mind was spinning. "You're telling me my father knew all of this?" I asked. Dr. Harris slowly shook his head. "We don't know. Your father never contacted us, never tried to sell it, and never displayed it publicly. That tells me he wasn't motivated by money. Either he didn't know its full history, or he believed protecting it was more important than profiting from it." I suddenly remembered something Dad had said countless times throughout my childhood. Some things become valuable because of the people who carry them. Back then, I thought he was talking about memories. Now I wondered if he had been trying to tell me something much deeper. I grabbed my car keys and immediately called Jake. He answered on the second ring with his usual carefree tone. "What's up?" he asked. "Jake," I said, trying to stay calm, "that watch you sold, where exactly did you take it?" He laughed. "Why? Did someone offer you $300 for it?" I took a deep breath before saying the words that completely changed his mood. "A museum just offered $2 million for it." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted several seconds. "You're joking," he finally whispered. "I wish I was," I replied. "Meet me at the pawn shop right now." 20 minutes later, Jake's face was pale as we walked into the small pawn shop together. The owner recognized him immediately and smiled. "Back already?" he asked. Jake forced a nervous laugh before pointing toward the empty display case. "The silver pocket watch I sold you a few days ago. I'd like to buy it back." The owner's smile faded. "Sorry," he said. "A collector bought it yesterday morning." My heart sank. Jake's shoulders dropped as if someone had taken the air out of him. "Do you have his name?" I asked. The owner hesitated before finally saying, "Normally I can't share customer information, but considering what's happening, I can tell you he lives about 40 minutes north of here. His name is Charles Bennett. He collects historical artifacts." We drove to Mr. Bennett's home without saying much. For the first time in years, Jake wasn't making excuses or jokes. He stared out the window, quietly replaying his decision over and over in his head. When we arrived, an elderly man welcomed us politely into his study. The room was filled with antique clocks, old maps, military uniforms, and shelves of carefully preserved historical pieces. Sitting in the center of his desk was my father's pocket watch. Seeing it again felt strangely emotional, almost as if a piece of Dad had found its way home. Mr. Bennett listened patiently as Dr. Harris explained everything about the hidden compartment and the museum's interest in the watch. Instead of looking excited about the money, the elderly collector gently picked up the watch and smiled. "I've been collecting history for over 50 years, he said. "Objects like this don't truly belong to any one person. They belong to the stories they preserve." He carefully pressed a tiny hidden latch beneath the watch's hinge. A soft click echoed through the room. Slowly, the back of the case opened farther than it should have, revealing an incredibly thin compartment hidden between the layers of silver. Inside was a tightly folded bundle of yellowed papers, still protected by wax cloth despite the passage of more than a century. Dr. Harris carefully unfolded the documents while wearing protective gloves. The room became completely silent. There were handwritten battlefield notes, personal letters exchanged between military leaders, and a signed journal describing events that historians had only guessed about for generations. But tucked beneath those papers was one final envelope, addressed in handwriting none of us recognized. On the front were just 6 simple words. "To the family who protects this." Every person in the room held their breath as Dr. Harris opened it. The letter explained that Captain Warren had entrusted the watch to a young schoolteacher after the war because he believed ordinary people could protect history better than powerful collectors or politicians. Generation after generation, the watch had quietly passed through families who understood its responsibility without ever seeking fame or fortune. Somewhere along the way, it eventually reached my father. Whether he knew the full story or simply honored the promise passed down to him, he had faithfully protected it for decades without asking for recognition. Reading those words, I finally understood why Dad treasured that worn silver watch more than anything else he owned. It had never been about wealth. It was about trust. Jake quietly sat down in the nearest chair and covered his face with both hands. "I sold Dad's legacy for $200, he whispered, his voice breaking. It was the first time since our father's funeral that I had seen my younger brother cry. I placed a hand on his shoulder, but neither of us spoke. Some mistakes are too heavy for words. Mr. Bennett looked around the room before making a decision none of us expected. "I'll donate the watch and every document to the museum. History belongs where everyone can learn from it." Dr. Harris thanked him and explained that the museum's board had already approved the $2 million acquisition fund for the watch. Mr. Bennett smiled and replied, "Then split the money between the Brooks family and a historical preservation foundation. Your father protected this treasure for decades. His family deserves to be remembered as part of its story." A few months later, the New England Museum opened a special exhibition dedicated to Captain Warren's watch and the extraordinary journey that had kept it safe for more than 150 years. One section of the exhibit was devoted entirely to my father, Robert Brooks, describing him simply as the Quiet Guardian. Thousands of visitors learned his name, not because he chased fame, but because he chose integrity over profit. Standing there beside Jake, I realized that was exactly the legacy Dad would have wanted. Jake changed after that day. He stopped chasing easy money and finally settled into a steady career restoring antique furniture, discovering that preserving the past brought him far more satisfaction than flipping things for quick cash ever had.
Every anniversary of Dad's passing, we visit the museum together. We stand in front of that old silver watch, now protected behind glass, and remember the man who taught us that true value isn't measured by price tags. It's measured by the lives we touch, the promises we keep, and the history we choose to protect. If this story reminded you that the greatest treasures are often the memories and values our loved ones leave behind, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You never know which ordinary object might be hiding an extraordinary story. Until next time, thank you for listening.